Well, thank you very much. Wonderful to be here. Thank you all for coming out. You see, you've joined me here in Springfield. As you can tell, I suppose some of you have been down here to the Capitol building, the new Capitol, as I called it. I think you call it the old state Capitol now for some reason. But in any event, I think we ought to maybe go inside because it's going to get dark here pretty soon. And here we are inside the state Capitol building here in the Hall of Representatives. In fact, you can see, I'll put my hat down. Well, there's my hat right over there on the table there. That was my seat in the General Assembly here. But we're getting ahead of ourselves because, of course, I didn't begin here. Now, thank you for coming out. Now, I'd only been living in Illinois for 2 years and in the town of New Salem for not even 6 months when I decided to run for political office for the first time. And not some little local office. I put my name in to be a representative of the people in the state legislature, the Illinois General Assembly, which at that time met in Vandalia, of course. At the time, elections in Illinois for the General Assembly, as well as for local offices and for the U.S. Congress, were held in August on the first Monday. Now, back then, the state was not divided into individual legislative districts. Instead, the seats were apportioned by county according to population. For the 1832 election, Sangamon County, which at that time included my town of New Salem, would have 4 seats. There were a total of 13 candidates, however, so I would need to do fairly well, finish in the top 4 in order to be elected. Note that Sangamon County was much larger back then, more than twice the size of what it would be by the end of the decade. In early March, 5 months before the election, I had a handbill printed in the Sangamo Journal announcing my campaign and what I would strive to do if elected. Despite my own family's Jacksonian Democrat heritage, I by this time had aligned myself with the opposition of what would soon become known as the Whig Party, whose national leader was Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky. Therefore, I was all for internal improvements, publicly funded projects to construct roads, canals, and railroads, improve navigation on rivers, etc. Well, I got my bill right here. I'll just read you part of it. Fellow citizens, having become a candidate for the honorable office of one of your representatives in the next General Assembly of this state, it becomes my duty to make known to you, the people whom I propose to represent, my sentiments in regard to local affairs. I then wrote on length the subject of internal improvements, noting, however, that while these were greatly beneficial, they should only be undertaken if they could be reasonably paid for. I therefore objected to a proposed railroad whose cost would be a heart-appalling shock, and suggested instead the improvement of the Sangamo River as an object much better suited to our infant resources. I gave a lengthy description of the river, its course, current, water levels, obstructions, and such, based on my own personal observations, concluding as follows: I believe the improvement of the Sangamo River to be vastly important and highly desirable to the people of this county, and if elected, any measure in the legislature having this for its object, which may appear judicious, will meet my approbation and shall receive my support. I then spoke against usury, that is, the practice of loaning money at exorbitant rates of interest, and in favor of education, calling it the most important thing that we as a people can be engaged in. That every man may receive at least a moderate education, and thereby be enabled to read the histories of his own and other countries, by which he may duly appreciate the value of our free institutions. Well, I talked a little bit more about that. And then I made a few comments about miscellaneous existing laws and ended my appeal as follows. Upon the subjects of which I have treated, I've spoken as I thought. I may be wrong in regard to any or all of them, but holding it a sound maxim, it is better to be only sometimes right than at all times wrong. So soon as I discover my opinions to be erroneous, I shall be ready to renounce them. Every man is said to have his peculiar ambition. Whether it be true or not, I can say, for one, I have no other so great as that, being truly esteemed by my fellow men, by rendering myself worthy of their esteem. How far I shall succeed in gratifying this ambition is yet to be developed. I am young and unknown to many of you. I was born and have ever remained in the most humble walks of life. I have no wealthy or popular relations to recommend me. My case is thrown exclusively upon the independent voters of this county, and if elected, they will have conferred a favor upon me for which I shall be unremitting in my labors to compensate. But if the good people, in their wisdom, shall see fit to keep me in the background, I have been too familiar with disappointments to be very much chagrined. Your friend, A. Lincoln. You will note in this handbill I did not mention any of the other candidates. I focused and said exclusively on what I would offer if people would see fit to choose me. Now, after about a month after announcing my candidacy, we suddenly had some more excitement. The year before, the Sauk, Fox, and Kickapoo Indian tribes had made an agreement with the government by which they were removed to the western side of the Mississippi River in what later became the state of Iowa. But now Chief Black Hawk, leader of the Sauk and Fox, led a large party back across the river into Illinois and the western portion of the Michigan Territory. The governor of Illinois called for the militia, and I joined up with the rest of the New Salem boys. One of our first tasks was to elect a captain. My name was put forward, as was that of William Kirkpatrick. I received 3/4 of the votes and was therefore elected. Many years and many elections later, I said that this election as militia captain was a success which gave me more pleasure than any I have had since. Most of the boys returned home after 1 month when our term expired, but I signed on for 2 additional months as a private in other companies. I arrived back in New Salem at the end of July, only about 1 week before the election. With hardly any time to campaign, it will come as no surprise that I was defeated. Remember that of the 13 candidates from Sangamon County, only the top 4 would be elected. I finished 8th. But I had done remarkably well in New Salem, winning over 90% of the vote there. Where the people know me, they voted for me, I thought. I just need to make myself better known throughout the whole county. And I set about doing that. Some of the other gentlemen from Sangamon County in that election might be familiar to you. John Todd Stewart, a lawyer in Springfield, finished 2nd and was elected. He would later encourage me in my law studies and also introduce me to his cousin, a certain Miss Mary Todd. Peter Cartwright, a well-known Methodist preacher, finished 4th and was also elected. He would be my opponent many years later when I ran for Congress. Cartwright narrowly defeated Archer Herndon for that 4th and final spot. Archer's son, William, would grow up to be my good friend and junior law partner. By the way, my defeat in that first election in 1832, when I was only 23 years old, would be the only time I would ever be defeated in a direct vote of the people. I would lose other elections, but these would not be direct votes of the people. That November, I was able to vote for the first time in a presidential election. I voted for Henry Clay over the Democratic incumbent, Andrew Jackson. This was the first of Clay's 3 attempts, all unsuccessful, for the presidency. In New Salem, Clay received only 27% of the votes, while I had received over 90%. This shows that the party divisions at that point weren't as strong as they would soon become. It also shows that personal popularity could be a strong motivating factor in determining how people vote. By the way, the manner in which elections were conducted back then might surprise you, especially if you are used to a so-called secret ballot. There was nothing secret about voting back then. In order to vote, why, you approached the bar in the election room and told the election judges and clerks the names of the persons you wished to vote for. And the clerks wrote down your name and selections. Now, do you think that could possibly affect how you choose to vote? 2 years later, I ran again for the Illinois General Assembly. Again, there were 13 candidates from Sangamon County, and again, the top 4 would be elected. But this time, I finished 2nd of the 13. I have been elected a representative of the people. By this time, the party divisions had become strong, but I still received a lot of votes from Democrats as well as Whigs. The former of these supported me on strictly personal grounds. I did very well in New Salem again, but the difference came in the rest of the county, where I received nearly 3 times as many votes as I had in 1832. Although New Salem was a majority Democrat, the county as a whole, especially Springfield, was majority Whig. Of the 4 candidates elected, 3 were Whigs and 1 was a Democrat. My lawyer friend John Todd Stewart finished 4th and was thus reelected. When it came time for the legislative session and west to south and east, to Vandalia, which at that time was still the capital of Illinois. We debated internal improvements during that session, and in particular, the long debated and long delayed proposal to build a canal to connect the Chicago River near Lake Michigan with the Illinois River, thus connecting the Great Lakes to the Mississippi River. Just as the Erie Canal had transformed New York State, we believe that our canal would transform Illinois. It might even lead to the rise of a little city on Lake Michigan at the mouth of the Chicago River, at the site of Fort Dearborn. This canal was going to cost a bit of money, of course, and so we also approved a $500,000 loan. We also chartered 16 railroad companies to link nearly every significant settlement in the state, reestablished the State Bank of Illinois, and voted to expand suffrage to all white males. In 1836, I sought re-election to another 2-year term to the General Assembly. This time there would be 7 representatives selected from Sangamon County instead of only 4, but there were also more candidates, 17 in all. This time, I received more votes than any of the other candidates. One of the new candidates elected was Ninian Wirt Edwards, son of a former governor. He was married to Elizabeth Todd. There's that name, Todd, again. Elizabeth would be the one to invite her younger sister Mary to live with her in Springfield a few years hence. The party divisions were even stronger this time. The 7 representatives elected were the 7 Whig candidates. Next came the 7 Democrats, and then finally the 3 not affiliated with either party. That November in the presidential election, I campaigned for the Whig candidate, William Henry Harrison, but he was defeated by President Jackson's hand-picked successor, Martin Van Buren. I would go on to campaign on behalf of my party's pick in every presidential election for the next 20 years until 1856. Of course, I would not campaign in 1860 or 64 when I was the nominee. That would be beneath the dignity of the presidential office to go out and beg for votes. No, back then we relied on surrogates to make our case for us. Van Buren had an advantage over Harrison in the 1836 election in that the Democrats had begun to adopt a controversial method known as the convention system. Here in Illinois, a certain Stephen Douglas, whom you'll be hearing a lot about, helped organize the first Illinois State Democratic Convention, where they all agreed to rally around one candidate, the aforementioned Van Buren. This didn't seem quite right to us Whigs, but we too would eventually be forced to do the same in order to stay relevant and competitive. When the legislative session began, we were faced with a problem. Many of those railroads we had approved in the previous session were having great difficulty raising the necessary capital. Therefore, we passed an ambitious Internal Improvements Act to provide for the construction and operation of 1,300 miles of railroads, as well as the improvement of all the larger rivers for navigation. This will be paid for through state-issued bonds, all tied into the anticipated growth of the state. You're not foreseeing any trouble here now, are you? The anticipated growth of the state, especially the sparsely populated northern half, played into another important decision we had to make. Back in 1819, the legislature had named Vandalia the state capital for a period of 20 years. It was now time to decide whether to leave it at Vandalia or to move it elsewhere, in particular somewhere more centrally located in the state. I, along with the other 6 representatives and the 2 senators from Sangamon County, pushed hard to get the capital moved to Springfield. We were called the Long Nine, as our average height was 6 feet tall. I was the tallest of the bunch. And in the end, I suppose our stature won the day, for Springfield won the prize. The capital would be moved to Vandalia, or from Vandalia to Springfield, as of 1839, in time for the next legislative session. Meanwhile, in 1838, I sought re-election again. By this time, I had left New Salem and removed to Springfield. There would again be 7 candidates selected from Sangamon County, and there were 7 representatives selected, and there were 16 candidates. I again received more votes than any of the other candidates. Ninian Wirt Edwards was re-elected, and also elected was my good friend, Edward D. Baker, for whom I would later name my second-born son. On a national level, John Todd Stewart was elected to Congress, narrowly defeating Stephen Douglas. All of the Whigs who were elected to the General Assembly, myself included, were part of what was now being called the Springfield Junto. The big election issue that year was the proposed creation of new counties, which would greatly decrease the size of Sangamon County. In general, the Whigs were against this, and the Democrats were for it. As a result, I lost a lot of support in New Salem and nearby Petersburg, which would presumably become the county seat of one of the new counties. As the legislative session opened, my status as a rising leader in the Whig Party was evidenced by my nomination to be Speaker of the Illinois House of Representatives. Since the Whigs were outnumbered by the Democrats, however, I was defeated. Remember all those grand projects we had started during the last few years, using borrowed money and counting on the growth of the state? Well, by 1839, Illinois was finding itself impacted by the Panic of 1837, which had begun out east, but eventually made its way to the whole nation. A drastic fall in agricultural prices was particularly damaging. If things didn't turn around soon, we would be in real trouble. In 1840, with the financial situation of the nation and state continuing to worsen, I sought re-election to my fourth term. By this time, the proposed division of Sangamon County, which the Whigs had opposed, had gone through, with the new counties of Menard, Logan, and Christian being created. With its reduced size, Sangamon County's representatives were reduced to 5. Although the power of the Springfield junto was waning by this time, the reduced size of the county meant that it was still predominantly Whig. There were 10 candidates, 5 Whigs and 5 Democrats. The 5 Whigs were elected. The presidential election that fall was a repeat of 1836. The Democrats, Van Buren, now the incumbent, versus the Whigs, Harrison. We Whigs had followed the Democrats' lead and held a state convention for the previous fall, but hadn't necessarily agreed on all of our preferred candidates. In addition to campaigning for Harrison that year, I was chosen as one of the official presidential electors on the ballot, a role I would have the honor of holding in every presidential election until 1856, except for 48 when I was in Congress. Since Stephen Douglas was campaigning for Van Buren, he and I engaged in some political debate. It wasn't the last time we would do so. You might say that Douglas got the best of me here in Illinois, which went for Van Buren, but Harrison won the national election, the first Whig ever elected president. Unfortunately, old Tippecanoe died just 1 month after taking the oath of office, whereupon his vice president, John Tyler, assumed office. When the General Assembly convened, I was very pleased. At this time, unlike my previous 3 sessions, I didn't have to endure a long journey to Vandalia and stay in a boarding house. This would be our first session in Springfield, in this, our new state capitol building, just 1 block away from the room I shared with my friend, Joshua Speed. I was again nominated by the Whigs to be Speaker of the House, and again defeated by the more numerous Democrats. This session was dominated by the financial crisis. We had to stop work on many of those great projects, although we kept going on the canal. But then on July 1st, 1841, state of Illinois defaulted on its interest payments, resulting in a sharp reduction in the value of its bonds. Illinois, a frontier state with just over 500,000 inhabitants, was deep in debt at a time of severe economic depression. Given my part in promoting all of these grand and expensive projects, I had gone from being one of the most popular politicians in the General Assembly to one of the least popular ones. I decided this would be a good time to take a little break from politics. I decided not to seek re-election. You might say, however, that I was engaged in another election during the years 1840 to 42, but this was not a political election. I mentioned earlier a certain Miss Mary Todd, who by this time was living in Springfield with her sister Elizabeth, the latter married to Ninian Wirt Edwards. The Todds were part of the Springfield aristocracy, with both Edwards and Mary's cousin John Todd Stewart, my senior law partner, very involved in politics. Mrs. Edwards had invited her unmarried and very eligible younger sister Mary to live with her in Springfield, in part to give her an escape from the difficult stepmother back in Lexington, but more to the point, to find her an appropriate husband from among the Springfield aristocracy. She had already successfully brought another sister, Frances, to Springfield and married her off. The suitors for Mary were in abundance, and among them was one particularly promising young man, a rising lawyer and politician with a bright future. His name, Stephen A. Douglas. As for me, I was at a decided disadvantage in relation to Douglas in nearly every respect: family connections, education, wealth, social graces, even physical appearance. Politically, he was clearly my superior, having by this time already served as state's attorney, Illinois Secretary of State, and state Supreme Court justice, in addition to state representative, Mary's family was totally against the idea of her marrying me when she might have Douglas or some other well-bred candidate. And given Mary's own stated ambition to marry so well as to someday see her husband occupy the presidency of the United States, Stephen Douglas was certainly a leading candidate for her heart. Douglas did have one particular disadvantage, however. Miss Todd was very interested in politics and had strong views on the subject, and she was most decidedly a Whig, her own father having served as a Whig politician back in Lexington. Why, she knew the great Henry Clay herself. Stephen Douglas, on the other hand, was a Democrat, in fact, a leader among the Democrats. Although there were also many other candidates for Miss Todd's affections, you might say that this was the first Lincoln-Douglas election. And you know who finally won this one. But why did Mary choose me over Douglas and all those better qualified and more handsome gentlemen? As Mary was heard to say, Mr. Lincoln may not be as handsome a figure, but the people are perhaps not aware that his heart is as large as his arms are long. To my Mary, character was more important than appearance. Having served those 4 terms in the state legislature, I now set my sights higher on the National Congress. The large population growth in Illinois during the 1830s meant that when the reapportionment took place after the 1840 census, the number of seats held by Illinois increased from 3 all the way to 7. Of the 7 newly drawn districts, however, 6 leaned Democratic and only 1 Whig. But that one Whig-leaning district happened to be the one I lived in, the one in central Illinois, including Sangamon County. By the way, not all states apportioned their congressional seats into districts at that time. Some of them still elected at-large representatives for the whole state. What this generally meant is that whichever party had a majority in the state got all of the congressional seats. And this obviously was not the fairest way to go about things. And as I recall, by 1864, all the states had done away with this. The 28th Congress, the one which would convene in December 1843, was the first at which these 7 new Illinois districts would apply. In the spring of that year, I helped write a series of resolutions addressed to the Whigs of Illinois. Among other things, we recommended the adoption of the convention system for the nomination of candidates, something the Democrats had already been doing for a number of years. I wrote that resolution myself and pointed out how we were losing elections because Whig candidates were going up against each other instead of everyone uniting around a single candidate. I cited both Aesop and Jesus to illustrate my point. The words of Jesus will certainly sound familiar to you because I would use them again in a different context 15 years later. That union is strength is a truth that has been known, illustrated, and declared in various ways and forms in all ages of the world. That great fabulist and philosopher, Aesop, illustrated it by his fable of the bundle of sticks. And he whose wisdom surpasses that of all philosophers has declared that a house divided against itself cannot stand. It is to induce our friends to act upon this important and universally acknowledged truth that we urge the adoption of the convention system. In its application, we know there will be incidents temporarily painful, but after all, we believe those incidents will be fewer and less intense with and without the system. If 2 friends aspire to the same office, it is certain both cannot succeed. Would it not then be much less painful to have the question decided by mutual friends sometime before than to snarl and quarrel till the day of the election and then both be beaten by the common enemy? The Whig Party convention for our congressional district would be held later that spring. I was one of 3 main aspirants for the nomination. The other 2 were John J. Hardin of Morgan County and my friend Edward D. Baker of Springfield. We were all lawyers in our young 30s, all up and coming and ambitious men who had served in the General Assembly, all veterans of war, and all known to be good stump speakers. Some of the 11 counties in the district favored Hardin, some Baker, and some me. I was disappointed when the Sangamon County Whigs endorsed Baker over me, and even more disappointed when they named me a delegate to the convention. As I wrote to my friend Joshua Speed, in getting Baker the nomination, I shall be fixed, a good deal like a fellow who is made groomsman to the man what has cut him out and is marrying his own dear gal. Ironically, the reason some of the Sangamon crowd voted against me was because I was associated with the aforementioned, and in their mind, aristocratic Springfield junto. As I wrote to one of my old friends from Menard County, it would astonish, if not amuse, the older citizens of your county, who 12 years ago knew me a stranger, friendless, uneducated, penniless boy, working on a flatboat at $10 per month, to learn that I have been put down here as the candidate of pride, wealth, and aristocratic family distinctions. As the convention approached, there was a lot of intrigue and suspicion about delegates going against their instructions in all directions. I wrote letters to friends to discourage all this, as it would be dishonorable and also sow discord in the party when we needed harmony. I went to the convention and did what I could to get Baker the nomination, but in the end, Hardin was chosen. It was at that point that I astonished everyone by rising and making a motion that at the next convention 2 years hence, they be requested to nominate Baker, thus establishing a system of rotation already used in other places. Hardin's friends objected that this would be the introduction of the most objectionable feature of Jacksonism into Whig policy, and my resolution was tabled. But 2 years later, that's exactly what happened. Baker was nominated. This meant, of course, that not only had I missed out on the nomination in 1843, but I missed out on it in 45 too. Thus, it essentially locked me out for 4 years or 2 congressional terms. As I had prophetically written in that resolution regarding the adoption of the convention system, in its application, we know there will be incidents temporarily painful. I just didn't realize how much the pain would be mine. At the same time, I hope it would set me up for the following nomination, which would end up taking place a year early in 1846. By the way, both Hardin and Baker won their elections, proving the 7th Congressional to be a true Whig-leaning district, the only one in Illinois. While in Congress, both held seats on the Military Affairs Committee, which is perhaps ironic, because Hardin would end up being killed in battle during the Mexican War, and Baker during the Civil War, by which time he was a U.S. Senator representing Oregon. I understand that Edward Baker, my good friend and namesake of my second-born son, is still the only sitting U.S. Senator to die in battle. Meanwhile, I bided my time during those 3 or 4 years, campaigning extensively for Henry Clay in Illinois and Indiana during the presidential election of 1844, to no avail, unfortunately, waiting patiently for my own opportunity. 46 finally came around, and I was chosen by the Whigs to be their representative, or to be their candidate, I should say. The campaign took place in late spring and early summer of 1846. The main issue before the voters was the Mexican War, which I, along with many other Whigs, especially Northern Whigs, believed to be unjust, unnecessary, and unconstitutional. A simple land grab on the part of President Polk in order to gain more territory into which to extend slavery. My Democratic opponent was a man I knew well, and who in fact was very well known, the Reverend Peter Cartwright, a Methodist circuit riding preacher who had been one of the first settlers of Sangamon County. The good Reverend knew that my own religious beliefs sometimes bordered on the unorthodox, and I heard rumors were being spread in certain parts that I was an infidel. I tried to ignore these, but fearing that they might be believed by just enough voters to change the outcome, I felt compelled to respond just 4 days before the election. I wrote up a handbill, which was distributed to voters and also published in the papers. Fellow citizens, a charge having got into circulation in some of the neighborhoods of this district, in substance, that I am an open scoffer at Christianity. I have, by the advice of some friends, concluded to notice the subject in this form. That I am not a member of any Christian church is true, but I have never denied the truth of the scriptures, and I have never spoken with intentional disrespect of religion in general, or of any denomination of Christians in particular. The foregoing is the whole truth, briefly stated, in relation to myself upon this subject. The results of the election in the various counties suggested that in those areas where this rumor had been spread, I did indeed lose votes. But it wasn't enough to change the outcome. The 7th Congressional remained safely in Whig hands. I had been elected to the U.S. Congress. Now came another long period of waiting, for it would be a full 16 months until the 30th Congress convened in December 1847. I assumed that I would travel alone to Washington, as was the custom of most members of Congress. But Mary insisted on coming along. This meant, of course, that our 2 young sons would also accompany us. Robert, who would be 4 by then, and our newborn Eddie, named for Edward Baker, who would be 1 1/2. We rented out our home here in Springfield, not intending to come back until the end of the second session in the spring of 1849. On our way to Washington, we stopped at Mary's childhood home in Lexington, where I got to hear the great Henry Clay speak, he who I called my beau ideal of a statesman. On December 6th, I took my seat in the House of Representatives. Just 16 days later, I issued a series of resolutions on the House floor demanding that President Polk demonstrate that the spot of land where the U.S. Army had been attacked and American blood had been shed was actually American soil and not the disputed territory between the Rio Nueces and the Rio Grande. My speech became known as the Spot Resolutions. President Polk never bothered to answer me, but I earned myself a nickname, Spotty Lincoln. It was not meant as a compliment. I do wish to make very clear, however, for there was some misinformation spread on this point, that although I opposed the war, I voted in favor of all expenditures for troops and supplies. Meanwhile, Mary discovered that life in Washington wasn't nearly so glamorous and exciting as she had imagined, having to spend most of her time cooped up in our boarding house with two very young sons needing her near constant attention, and with me very occupied with business. She therefore left with our boys to stay with her father back in Lexington. But then we missed each other. Mary came back to Washington in June, not long after I had attended the National Whig Party convention in Philadelphia, where we adopted the mindset of, if you can't beat them, join them, and nominated a Mexican war hero, General Zachary Taylor, as our candidate for president for the election that fall. As was my custom, I gave speeches for our candidate, but this time out east. The presidential election that year was the first time that every state voted on the same day, and General Taylor defeated the Democrats' Lewis Cass and the Free Soilers' Martin Van Buren. With the Mexican War over, the issue of slavery returned to the forefront in our second session. When we reconvened in December, some of my fellow Whigs introduced a resolution to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia, which failed, as had all such previous resolutions. It was then that I decided to introduce my own resolution, a compromise measure, which I sincerely thought could gain sufficient support to be passed. My proposal was to allow the voters in the district to decide the matter for themselves. If passed, the abolition of slavery in the district would take effect the following January 1st. Unfortunately, it turned out that I had been rather naive to think that my proposal would be acceptable to a Congress which was becoming ever more divided on any issue related to slavery. I had not sought to be renominated, given our prior agreement to rotate the position. Not that I would have been chosen in any event. I learned the hard way that it is not a popular thing to oppose a war. A friend who learned the same lesson put it this way: in the future, I shall be in favor of war, pestilence, and famine. No, I had managed again to make myself unpopular in Illinois, and it looked like for the second time in my career, my political career was over. In fact, my unpopularity besmirched even the Whig candidate who was to replace me, as he lost the election. Not that I would have done things differently. I believe that one always ought to stand up for what's right, for what one believes in, even if it's not popular. As my idol, Henry Clay, famously said, I would rather be right than president. Of course, this meant that despite trying 3 times, Henry Clay never was president. By the way, during my one term in Congress, I met many people who would later play an important role in the affairs of the nation when I was president, such as Representatives Horace Greeley of New York, Caleb Smith of Indiana, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee, and Alexander Stephens of Georgia, as well as Senators Simon Cameron of Pennsylvania, Hannibal Hamlin of Maine, and Jefferson Davis of Mississippi. We returned here to Springfield, but having helped to get General Taylor elected president, I did expect a little reward. I was really hoping for the general land office, but they bypassed me for that and instead offered me the governorship of Oregon Territory. Governor Lincoln. I kind of like the sound of that. But when I told Mary, she said, Oregon? We're already pretty far west here in Illinois. Besides, they're mostly Democrats out there. Not much of a future for you. She was right, of course. Mary was always looking out for my political future, and so she turned down that job for me. Instead of moving to Oregon, we stayed here in Illinois, right here in Springfield. During the next several years, I didn't involve myself much in politics, although I did deliver eulogies at the passing of 2 political giants, in 1850 in Chicago for President Taylor, who had died in office, and in 1852 in Springfield for my idol, Henry Clay. But then came the year 1854 when the great slavery question rose up again. Senator Douglas introduced and Congress passed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which changed everything. This new law meant that instead of having slavery contained in just one part of the country, with the hope and expectation that one day we might be rid of it, slavery would now be allowed to spread into the West, even to the North. We might never get rid of slavery now. I started giving speeches denouncing this and also decided to seek political office again. By this time, elections for the Illinois General Assembly were being held in November instead of August. I ran for and won a seat in the General Assembly, but I really had my sights set much higher. I had already been a state representative and even a congressman. The next logical step would be a U.S. senator. And it happened that Illinois' other Senate seat, the one not held by Douglas, would soon be up for election. Remember that U.S. senators were not elected directly by the people back then. They were chosen by the state legislatures. Thus, my winning a seat in the General Assembly meant that I would help choose the next senator. But there was some dispute as to whether a sitting member of the General Assembly could be chosen. And so I resigned my seat just 3 days after being elected. It would prove to be a rash and foolish decision. For not only would I not end up being chosen senator, but in the special election to fill my vacated seat, a Democrat was elected instead of a Whig. By this time, a tumultuous reordering of the entire political landscape was well underway. Prior differences between Democrats and Whigs faded to the background, and the major dividing line became that of one's position on the Kansas-Nebraska Act, or simply Nebraska. The anti-Nebraska side wished to prevent slavery from extending into new areas of the country, while the Nebraska side either desired its extension or tried not to concern themselves with the issue. The Whig Party was already starting to collapse under the pressure, and in its place was rising up a disparate coalition of anti-Nebraska voices, which included anti-slavery Whigs, disenchanted Democrats, free soilers, and nativists such as the Know Nothings or American Party, a coalition which was already beginning to coalesce under the name Republican. As evidence of the state of confusion, consider that when the U.S. House of Representatives attempted to elect a Speaker of the House, it took 2 months and 133 ballots with more than 20 names put forward. The election of the U.S. Senator from Illinois by the General Assembly would also prove contentious. After months of posturing and positioning, the vote took place in early February 1855. There were 3 leading candidates. The Democratic incumbent, James Shields, was a Nebraska man, while I, still representing the Whig Party, and Congressman Lyman Trumbull, a Democrat, were decidedly anti-Nebraska. There were also a few other minor candidates, and for an extra dose of intrigue, a behind-the-scenes effort by Democratic Governor Joel Matheson to secure the seat for himself. Shields, by the way, is the man who once challenged me to a duel. The 100 members of the General Assembly were about evenly split between the Nebraska and anti-Nebraska sides. But there were also other issues and loyalties which complicated the situation. I and Trumbull together, however, appeared to have just enough support to give the victory to the anti-Nebraska side. In fact, on the first ballot, I got 44 votes and Trumbull 5, for a total of 49, just 1 short of the 50 needed by a single candidate to win. As the next few ballots were taken, 2 or 3 others voted for me, which would have given me the election if those 5 Trumbull men would join us. But these 5 were all staunch Democrats who absolutely refused to vote for a Whig. Since Trumbull's supporters, led by Norman Judd, wouldn't budge, those who preferred me began to gradually switch their votes over to Trumbull. Even as on the Nebraska side, the votes were being switched from Shields to Governor Madison. In the 9th round of balloting, Madison reached 47 votes, just 3 short of victory. I knew that the governor had been selling himself as an anti-Nebraska man at heart, even though that wasn't consistent with his past affiliations and actions. Sensing that he would win on the 10th ballot, unless the anti-Nebraska men coalesced around a single true anti-Nebraska candidate, I told my followers to vote for Trumbull. When they protested the injustice of the candidate who had 90% of the anti-Nebraska vote in the early ballots, gifting the election to the one who had only 10%, I said, you will lose both Trumbull and myself, and I think the cause in this case is to be preferred to men. My men ceded, and Trumbull was elected senator with the necessary 50 votes on the 10th ballot. The result was clearly unfair to me. In fact, Mary, who watched it all from the gallery, right up there, never forgave neither Trumbull nor Judd. She even forever severed her relationship with Trumbull's wife, Julia, who had been her very close friend, each of them having been a bridesmaid at the other's wedding. I took a longer view of the situation. I was severely disappointed, of course, but took satisfaction in the fact that Illinois had elected a committed anti-Nebraska senator to counterbalance Douglas. I had also thwarted the machinations of Madison, whom I didn't trust to stay true to the anti-Nebraska cause. Perhaps most significantly, the whole exercise also served to strengthen the growing anti-Nebraska coalition at both the state and national levels, as Trumbull's inclusion opened the way for other anti-slavery Democrats to join the cause. In fact, this was an important step in the Republican Party becoming a viable and powerful political force. In light of all this, my humiliating personal defeat was of little significance. As I wrote to a friend, I could not let the whole political result go to ruin on a point merely personal to myself. In addition, Trumbull and Judd would forever remember my generous and self-sacrificing gesture and would support me 4 years later when I ran for Illinois' other Senate seat against Douglas. Judd would also play an important role in my run for the presidency in 1860, and Trumbull would later co-author the 13th Amendment to the Constitution, which would be my greatest legislative victory as president. Meanwhile, over the next year, the movement to unite all the anti-Nebraska voices, all those opposed to the extension of slavery, into one new political party gained strength. I, for one, however, was not yet ready to give up on the Whig Party, the only party I had identified with during my entire political life. And by 1856, however, it was clear the Whig Party was nearly dead, and I finally threw my lot with the new Republican Party. We would hold our first ever national convention in the middle of June in Philadelphia. State conventions were likewise called in many of the northern states. In Illinois, it was decided to hold the convention in Bloomington on May 29th. I chaired the nominating committee for state offices and was named a statewide elector at large for the presidential election. I was also named a delegate to the upcoming national convention, an honor I would have to decline because I had neither the time nor the money to attend. Although I had not been scheduled to speak, I was spontaneously called upon by the crowd to do so as the convention closed. I gave a rousing hour-and-a-half long address, which came to be known as my lost speech. Supposedly lost because the newspapermen were so enthralled that they stopped taking notes. I called on all present to put aside their differences and commit themselves wholeheartedly to the movement to fight against the extension of slavery. The increasingly violent slave power must be resisted. Kansas must be free. Republican principles must be preserved, and the Union must be maintained. At the National Republican Convention in Philadelphia a few weeks later, John C. Fremont was nominated for president. When it came time to nominate a vice presidential candidate, someone put forward my name without my knowledge. Other nominees included Dayton of New Jersey, Wilmot of Pennsylvania, and Banks and Sumner of Massachusetts, among others. Given how well known and respected these other gentlemen were, I was quite surprised to learn that I received the second highest number of votes after Dayton. It was a sign that I was beginning to get recognized as a leading Republican voice well beyond Illinois. Fremont and Dayton would lose that election that fall, although they won all of the New England states, along with New York and 4 Western, what you call Midwestern states. The Republican cause was damaged by the strong showing of the nativist American Party, the so-called know-nothings, who got over 20% of the vote and undoubtedly took more from the Republicans than from the Democrats. In any event, it would be the Democrat, James Buchanan, who would be inaugurated as our nation's 15th president. Buchanan was inaugurated on March 4th, 1857, and just 2 days later, the Supreme Court issues its decision in Dred Scott versus Sanford, ruling that no slave nor his descendant, even if a free person, could be a citizen of this country, and therefore had no standing to sue in federal court. They ruled furthermore that Congress had no authority to exclude slavery from the territories, nor could any territorial government exclude slaves. This convinced me and many others that a slave conspiracy had infiltrated the highest levels of our national government. Their objective was to make slavery a nationwide institution. That's the direction our country seemed to be heading in 1857. And this is why the next year, when Senator Douglas was up for re-election, it was such an important election, not only for Illinois, but for the whole nation. The Illinois Republican Convention was held in June here in Springfield and nominated me as their unanimous choice for the Senate election, which would take place in the General Assembly that winter. On the day of my nomination, I gave a speech you might remember. Right here in this very room, by the way. A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the House to fall. but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other, all free or all slave. After that, I went out and started giving speeches, conveniently showing up just before or just after Douglas, whenever and wherever he was speaking. I challenged him to a series of debates, dozens of debates all over the state. He finally agreed to a limited series of debates, if I'd just leave him alone, one in each congressional district, except for Chicago and Springfield, where we'd both already spoken. Our 7 debates that summer and fall were widely followed throughout the whole nation. Although you may know of them today as the Lincoln-Douglas debates, Mr. Douglas, if he were here, would be quick to point out to you that back in our day, they were known as the Douglas-Lincoln debates. He was the incumbent. I was the challenger. He was well known throughout the nation and already the presumed nominee of the Democratic Party for president in 1860. He had already served 2 terms or 12 years as U.S. Senator. My only national experience was that single brief and unremarkable 2-year term as a representative, which had ended nearly 10 years before. The name of Douglas was known to all the nation. The name of Lincoln was still largely unknown. When I was nominated for the Senate that year, the New York Times reported my name as Alvane Lincoln. 2 years later, when I was nominated for president, they would get a little closer with Abraham Lincoln. Remember that we were not soliciting votes for Lincoln or Douglas. We were asking the people to vote for the Republican or Democratic candidates for the Illinois General Assembly. And when the vote was held on November 2nd, more votes were cast for Republicans than for Democrats. In fact, we swept the statewide elections for governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, etc. But I already knew that it wasn't going to be enough for me. The population of Illinois had grown much faster in the northern part of the state during the 1850s than the southern part, but the apportionment of legislative districts was still based on the 1850 census, meaning that votes in the South, where the Democrats were stronger, counted more than votes in the North, where Republicans were stronger. In addition, 13 of the 25 seats were not up for re-election that year, and more of these were held by Democrats than Republicans. This all meant that despite the statewide Republican victory, the new General Assembly would be composed of 54 Democrats and 46 Republicans. And that was exactly the outcome when the General Assembly voted for U.S. Senator. 54 votes for Douglas, 46 for me, a straight party vote. Just as 4 years previous, it seemed that I had again been somewhat unjustly denied the opportunity to serve as senator. It was a difficult loss, but I had done my best and had also, I believe, set Douglas up for defeat 2 years hence, should he be chosen as expected, the Democratic nominee for presidency in the election of 1860. Oh, and given that the eyes of the entire nation have been on Illinois during this time, the name of Lincoln was now known throughout the country. I started getting many more invitations to go to this place or that to give speeches. I couldn't accept them all, but I did make a few trips. A tour Ohio and Indiana and Wisconsin, a week in Kansas, 2 weeks in New York and New England. This last tour included my famous Cooper Union address in New York City, where I gave a spirited defense of our right, even our duty to oppose the extension of slavery, concluding as follows: let us have faith that right makes might, and in that faith, let us to the end dare to do our duty as we understand it. When I returned home to Springfield after my Northeastern trip, there remained only 2 months until the Republican National Convention. The convention was originally going to be held somewhere in Ohio, as I recall. But toward the end of 1859, my friends David Davis and Jesse Fell had gotten the idea. If the convention could be moved to Chicago, it would help my chances. Not that my chances were very good, you understand. Everyone expected that William Seward of New York would be our nominee. And if for some reason it wasn't him, well, there was Chase of Ohio, Bates of Missouri, any number of other better qualified candidates than me. But Davis and Fell insisted that I suggest this idea to the Republican state chairman, who happened to be Norman Judd, the one who had ruined my chances to be senator back in 1855. Judd agreed and went to see the Republican National Committee in New York, where he made the case that Ohio wasn't an appropriate location, as it was Chase's home state. He suggested Chicago instead, a neutral location. And the committee agreed, which tells you no one was thinking about me as a serious contender. Chicago built a grand wooden structure called the Wigwam, which will hold 10,000 people comfortably, the largest auditorium in the country, and with wonderful acoustics. I did not attend the convention, of course. None of the candidates did that. Instead, I awaited news back here in Springfield, where I received regular reports by telegraph. Now, I'm not sure how much of the following story is true, but I've been told that the managers of my campaign felt that something underhanded must have taken place for so many of Seward's supporters to have gotten the tickets for the main seating area. And they thought, well, two can play this game. And they had 300 duplicate tickets printed up for the day of the balloting and distributed these to some Illinois boys, telling them to show up early and go in there and make some noise for old Abe. The New Yorkers, meanwhile, took their time arriving, parading through the streets behind a brass band. And by the time they got to the wigwam, they discovered their seats taken by the Illinois boys. They were still allowed in, and it didn't change who could vote. But the Seward contingent was no longer the dominant voice in the convention. I know this sort of thing doesn't normally happen in Chicago, but even more importantly, however, I was nicely positioned as a moderate. The leading candidates tended toward one side or the other. Seward and Chase toward the radical side, Bates toward the conservative side. We felt that if the supporters of these candidates couldn't get their man, they would naturally move to the middle, where I was, just waiting for them. In addition, given my lifelong habit of always striving to make friends and avoiding making enemies, I didn't have sworn enemies like many of the others had. In the end, I was nominated on the third ballot with Hannibal Hamlin of Maine as my running mate. As expected, the Democratic Party nominated my old friend and rival, Stephen Douglas. But just as I predicted back in 1858, Douglas couldn't hold the party together anymore, and the Southern Democrats bolted and nominated Vice President John Breckinridge of Kentucky as their candidate. This, of course, would improve my chances quite a bit. There was even a fourth candidate, John Bell of Tennessee, of the Constitutional Union Party. Given the greater population of the North, it was apparent that only two of us, however, had any real possibility of winning the electoral vote outright, and that would be Douglas and me. I told you earlier that presidential candidates back then didn't go out campaigning, leaving that to surrogates to do on their behalf. I kept to that custom, but Douglas got a bit desperate and hit the campaign trail. The final week before the election found him on a tour of the Deep South, speaking at various locations in Georgia and Alabama. It didn't do him any good, as he didn't win those states, nor any northern states either. In fact, the only state he won outright was Missouri, despite getting 30% of the popular vote overall. As for me, I received about 40% of the popular vote, but won all the electoral votes in the North, except for New Jersey, which I split with Douglas. I received a total of 180 electoral votes, 32 more than needed to win. This Republican victory signaled a change in course for our nation on the subject of slavery. Namely, that while it would still be allowed in the South, it would not be allowed to overrun the rest of the nation. As a result, within 3 months of my election, 7 of the slave states decided to secede from the Union and form what they called a new country, the Confederate States of America. After I took the oath of office, the situation only grew worse as the Civil War began, when we tried to send provisions to Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Confederates fired on the fort. 4 more slave states soon joined the Confederacy, bringing the total to 11, and the fighting would soon begin in earnest. 3 long years later brought us to 1864, with no end in sight of our terrible Civil War. As a result, the Republican Party was by no means united behind me, with the radical Republicans especially keen on finding an alternative candidate for the upcoming presidential election. Their first attempt was to secretly plot to replace me with Salmon Chase, my Secretary of the Treasury, with Chase's full knowledge. They made the case that we had failed to win the war because of my vacillation and indecision, the feebleness of my will, and my want of intellectual grasp. When this secret plot was uncovered in February, however, it had the opposite of its intended effect, as most in the Republican Party rallied around me, and Chase was discredited. But then just 1 week before a scheduled convention in Baltimore in early June, a splinter group of about 400 radicals held an alternate convention in Cleveland and nominated John Fremont, who had been the first Republican presidential candidate back in 1856. They dubbed their new party the Radical Democracy Party. Meanwhile, at our regular convention in Baltimore, I was renominated, but the party chose to adopt the name National Union Party. We wanted those Democrats who supported the war to join us. We even named a Democrat, and a Southern Democrat at that, my running mate, Andrew Johnson of Tennessee. And the Democratic Party, they nominated former Union General George McClellan, but on a platform of peace. We're tired of this war. We want peace, peace at any cost. Or the cost we all knew would either be to grant the Confederacy her independence, to divide into 2 nations, a free North and a slave South, or to remain one nation, but leave slavery intact, forever intact in the South. Neither option sounded good to me. By late summer, it was becoming increasingly clear that I would not be reelected. Partly due to this, some people, especially Republicans, began to suggest that we postpone or even cancel the election. But I would have none of this. We had never delayed nor canceled a presidential election, not even during the War of 1812. And I could not imagine any situation which would warrant such an action. We cannot have free government without elections, I said. Still, holding an election during a civil war created all sorts of difficulties. For one, how would the soldiers in the field vote? The laws in place did not allow for absentee voting. Therefore, many of the northern states passed new laws to allow soldiers to cast ballots at their military camps or to mail in their ballots. But some of the northern states under Democratic control refused to make such provisions, knowing they would likely help me more than McClellan. The only way to allow the soldiers in these states to vote would be to allow them to return home for the election. We encouraged our generals to furlough such soldiers for the necessary period of time if they could do so without jeopardizing the war effort. The Republicans in Congress are so desperate for every possible electoral vote that they went to a great effort to admit Nevada as a 36th state before the election. The state constitution was supposed to arrive by train, but was slow in coming. So they arranged for it to be telegraphed instead, a process which took 2 days and cost a good deal of money, but it got Nevada admitted a week before the election. Even the soldier vote and Nevada's 3 electoral votes, however, would not be enough to provide for my reelection if the military situation continued as it was. Thankfully, however, fate or providence intervened. Beginning in late August, continuing through the fall, the military situation in the Eastern Theater began to improve. Fremont abandoned his campaign, leaving me to face only McClellan. By the election in November, the people of the North were willing to stick it out a while longer, as it appeared that the end of the war might finally be in sight. In the end, I won fairly easily, with 55% of the popular vote, and perhaps up to 80% of the military vote, and nearly all the electoral votes. Perhaps most significantly, I have become the first president to be reelected in more than 30 years, the last being Andrew Jackson. And that, I'm sorry to say, was my last election. By the way, were you keeping track? I hear some people today will talk about my numerous failures to be elected until I was somehow suddenly elected president. But I've just told you about the 9 times I was in a direct election by the people. 5 times for the General Assembly, 1 time for Congress, another time for the General Assembly, and then twice for president. I lost the very first of these 9 elections when I was but 23 years old, but I won the next 8. And I tried twice to be senator, which were not direct votes of the people. And you might say that I really should have been chosen both times. And then there are those 2 non-political elections, one for captain during the Black Hawk War, and the other for the hand of Miss Mary Todd. And I won both of those. Do I still sound like a miserable failure in terms of elections? I trust you've enjoyed learning about my political side, about my many interesting campaign and election experiences over a long and eventful career, during a time of political intrigue and tumult, when the very destiny of our nation was at stake. I thank you for your attention during this hour we spent together. And now, of course, we have time for you to ask me some questions. Of course, I can only answer questions from my own time period. Up to about April 14th, 1865. I really can't go past that. So in any event, I'm supposed to answer questions or ask questions. You have a couple ways to do this, right? They can either, well, actually with the webinar, do they have to use the Q&A?
Yeah, I believe too, I can allow them to talk.
Okay.
So
That's fine with me.
they want to raise their, is there a way they can raise their hands, Tom?
I let me look.
There should be a way to raise hands too. Yeah.
Yeah, there should be.
Oh, okay, there's some raised hands.
Oh, you see it? Okay, I was gonna say.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I see. Okay, let's see. Let's see if I can. Okay. Are you?
Yeah, I see.
Oh, we also
Yes.
have the chat. We have somebody in the chat. Okay, it's just from Sharon. Thank you so much. Well, I
Yes,
think
Irvin?
I'm wondering, what was your childhood like? You know, your relationship with your father? I saw somewhere that he felt his father had hired him out like a servant, and that's one of the reasons he was opposed to slavery.
well, that might be a bit of an exaggeration. I'll say this. My pa and I had different ideas about what I should be in my life. He thought I should just follow in his footsteps, become a farmer and a carpenter. That was just fine for him. He saw no need for me to improve myself through education. He didn't much like me reading all the time and studying, so no need for that. Well, he never had that in his life, and he got along just fine. But of course, I had different ideas, and I was encouraged by my ma and then later by my stepma, who did value education and thought that I could make something of myself, you see. And so as I was a young man, after I left home, my pa and I were not close at all. But I was very close to my stepmother still. But my pa, well, yeah, he used to hire me out back growing up. He hired me out to neighbors to work, in addition to work at home, of course. He hired me out to neighbors, and all the money I earned by law, I had to give to him till I was 21. And in that sense, I did feel kind of like a hired laborer, if you will. And so I resented that a little bit. I'll say that. But we just had different ideas about things. He was a good man. My pa was a good man. He was a wonderful storyteller. I learned that from him too, a deacon in the church and all that. We just had different ideas about life and what man should strive to do and so on. The value of education and so on. Good question.
So by law, you had to give him all your wages until you were 21?
21. I believe that's the way it worked. I don't know if it was actually a state law in Indiana there, or but it seemed to be a law. I mean, that's pretty much everyone did.
Thank you.
Does anyone else have any questions or comments? I personally think that you should run again for president.
You think I should run again? Oh, I've already been there, done that. I think things have probably changed. It's been a long time. Back in my day, politics was very uncivil. I'm sure much different today. And back in my day, the newspapers were very partisan. I'm sure today your news media is much more objective and unbiased. I'll tell you, I gave a speech once, and the Chicago Tribune wrote, "The dedicatory remarks of President Lincoln shall live in the annals of man." Good Republican paper, Joseph Medill. And the Chicago Times, they talked about my silly, flat, dishwatery remarks. Talking about the very same speech, little address I made out at Gettysburg. Almost like they'd written the articles ahead of time and just filled in the details later. But as I said, your media today is probably much more objective and unbiased. Another question.
No more questions?
More questions.
Let's see. Here's one. I don't
Go
know if
ahead.
you'll be able to answer it because it's not during your time period. What are the best movies about you, even if you haven't seen them?
Well, a movie, I'm not sure what a movie is. Sometimes I have kids insist that I was at a movie theater once and got in some trouble there. And I said, I don't know what a movie theater is. I've been to the theater quite a bit. Well, if I were to speculate and look to the future, and when you have these motion pictures, I don't know. I think there was one once with a feller named Henry Fonda, a young Mr. Lincoln. I haven't seen the whole thing myself, but I understand that's a pretty good one. And then, of course, there's one not too long ago, a fellow named Spielberg did a movie about 8 years ago now, I suppose, called Lincoln. That's focusing especially on the fight to get the 13th Amendment passed in Congress. I kind of based on that book of Doris Kearns Goodwin called Team of Rivals. So that's a pretty good one, I suppose. I will say, though, I think they kind of overplayed the case. In this movie, as you call it, they had these two gentlemen going around trying to bribe senators and congressmen to change their vote. Now, I'm sure a little bit of that went on, but I think they overstated the case, you see. Think about this. By that point in time, we had elections in the previous fall, right? We talked about those. And in the elections in November 1864, the new incoming Congress was going to be in support overwhelmingly of the 13th Amendment. You see, there were no need, and they would come in, well, they wouldn't normally come till December, but I could call them in special session as early as March 4th. So my question for you is, how far would I go, knowing my character, to get the vote done before, by end of January, for example, rather than just wait a few weeks, bring in the new Congress, and they do it without any bribes, without any of that. So as I say, I think that maybe they just overstated the case, but I understand it's made in a place called Hollywood, and sometimes they do that. They kind of take a story and embellish it just a little bit, make it more interesting. Good question.
Any more questions?
I guess I already answered that one.
Yep.
Oh, off the quiet cried. Oh, wait, this is Julie has raised her hand.
Okay, let me get to her.
And she says, I have a question in the chat box. So we need to get a question from Julie somehow.
Okay, Julie, you're ready to talk. Tom, what am I doing wrong?
Let's see, let me look.
Okay, my microphone was off.
Okay, there you go. Okay.
Hi, Mr. Lincoln. Hi, Sylvia. Hi, everyone.
Oh, there.
So I was curious, you mentioned the telegraph and you mentioned, you covered a lot of ground getting from the Midwest to New York and so forth. And so I was wondering how, and the newspapers covered your stories. So let's say you were in Springfield and you had to get to New York for a convention or Washington, D.C. How much time did it take you to get there? And how did you get messages around, quickly to people? Because you accomplished so much.
Well, a message can travel much faster than a man.
Mhm.
A man, of course, has to travel either by train. That's the fastest way to go back then. But you figure Springfield to New York, well, that's at least a trip a day, maybe 2 days on train to get there. I'd say 2 days, really. Whereas a telegraphic message, you could do almost in a matter of minutes. Send it from Springfield to New York. It might have to go through Chicago, something like that, but it could get there in just a matter of minutes. Depends how long the message is, of course.
Yeah.
I mentioned that Constitution from Nevada, that took 2 days, but it's a very long document, of course. But
Right.
just a short, brief message, you could send that in a matter of minutes.
Mhm.
So
Well,
we used to telegraph quite a bit during the war, of course.
Mhm.
And of course, it's an important tool, which means we're always trying to cut the lines of the other side, right? That was always the problem.
Mhm.
Confederates cutting our lines, we're cutting their lines to
Mhm.
keep that communication from happening. Otherwise, but it's not always secure either. You kind of tap into the lines, you understand me? So
Yeah.
if you really want a secure message, the better way is to send it with a personal messenger. So to give it to a gentleman and he would take it. And if you want to really, really be secret, of course, you code the message somehow.
Yeah. Wow. Well, you got a lot done with those methods.
We did.
Thank
A
you.
telegraph office was very important. That was the last place I stopped pretty much every day. Before I went to bed, I went to the War Department. That's where we had the telegraph office. And I read the dispatches from the front. Sometimes good news, more often bad news.
Mhm.
I go through the whole list of dispatches until I got to the bottom, and then go to bed.
Yeah. Yeah.
Good
Thank you.
question. Somebody else
Well,
have a question?
I don't know. Well, looks like we have a quiet crowd. And thank you so much, Mr. Lincoln, President Lincoln. And we'll let you then go to bed.
Well, I do appreciate it. I'm going to try out your telegraph machine just because I'm curious how it works. I'm going to see if you don't have to type in dots and dashes, do you? You just type in the letters directly? How about that? And I'm going to just, I understand, in case you're curious about want more information, I think it's called a website. Anyway, you can go there and it's called mrlincoln.com if you want more information about what I do and different places I go. I go to schools and libraries and museums and senior homes. Well, at least I used to go to all those places. Now we just do it this way for the most part. But I'm looking forward to getting back into those sorts of places. So if you know anyone who would be interested in having me do a program, let me know. And I do 14 different programs for adult audiences. I even do programs in Spanish. El Presidente, Abraham Lincoln. So anyway, thank you very much for coming out.
Thank you. And everyone have a good night.